The fog that settled over Ashbourne Cemetery on the morning of October the 4th, 1895, was the kind that did not merely hang in the air. It pressed down. It crept beneath collars and slipped through the seams of mourning coats, reaching for skin the way grief reaches for the living. Patient, insistent, without mercy. Sebastian Alaric Hawthorne, the 8th Duke of Ashbourne, stood at the edge of the freshly turned earth, with his hands clasped behind his back, and his jaw so tightly set that the muscle beneath his cheek had been twitching for the better part of an hour. The headstone before him was white marble, still clean, still new, the carved letters not yet darkened by rain or time. Aurelia Ashbourne, 1872-1895, beloved wife and duchess. Beside it, a smaller stone, his chest contracted around it like a fist closing. Lord Edward Ashbourne, 1895, beloved heir, born and buried in the same month. That was the cruelty that no man's station could protect him from. Not title, not wealth. Not the great stone walls of Ashbourne Hall, which had stood for 300 years and had kept out armies. It had not kept out death. Sebastian did not weep. He had not wept in 31 days. Not since the physician had emerged from Aurelia's chamber, with that particular stillness about him that a man wore when the words he carried were too heavy to hold much longer. Sebastian had stood in the corridor, with the wallpaper pressing its damask pattern into his vision, and heard the words, and he had felt something inside him go very, very quiet. He was 31 years old, and already he had buried a wife and a son. The servant stood at a respectful distance. His solicitor, Mr. Percival Faulkner, waited near the iron gate with a black umbrella he had not opened because it was not yet raining, though both men knew it soon would be. His younger brother, Lord Dorian Hawthorne, stood 3 paces to Sebastian's left, silent and pale, his hat held against his chest in both hands. Dorian was 26, and in most respects the easier Hawthorne, warmer of manner, quicker to smile, and had spent the autumn in a quiet courtship of a Miss Vivian Roberts of Bath, that Sebastian had not had occasion to attend to properly, between one grief and another. None of them spoke, which was why, when the voice came, it cut through the silence like a blade through silk. "Please, sir, your grace, I have something you need to know." Sebastian turned his head slowly. She was standing just beyond the iron cemetery fence, her fingers wrapped around 2 of the cold black bars, as though she was either pressing in or holding herself back from fleeing. A girl, 10 years old, perhaps 11. Her brown hair was tangled and pulled away from a thin, pale face by a piece of faded ribbon. Her dress was the color that dresses became when they had been washed too many times with too little soap, a brownish gray that had once been something warmer. Over her shoulders, she wore a shawl 2 sizes too large, its fringe dragging in the wet grass. At her feet sat a wicker basket filled with flowers, pink roses and white daisies, modest things, the kind sold on street corners for pennies. Her eyes were enormous, dark, and very steady for a child who was speaking to a duke through cemetery bars on a cold October morning. "Your heir still lives, your grace," she said. "The boy in the portrait. He is alive." And Sebastian Hawthorne, who had not wept in 31 days, watched as the miniature portrait he had been holding in his gloved right hand slipped from his fingers and fell into the wet grass at his feet. His name was Sebastian Alaric Hawthorne. His father had been the 7th Duke of Ashbourne, a man of considerable military distinction and very little warmth, and his mother had died when Sebastian was 9, which meant he had been formed, largely, by absence, by the silences between the things that should have been said, in a house full of portraits of dead ancestors, and rooms kept locked for no reason anyone could remember. He had grown into precisely the sort of man that English society approved of and privately feared. Tall, well over 6 feet, with the broad shoulders of someone who had spent his 20s in serious riding and sport, rather than in drawing rooms. dark hair, cut close. Eyes the color of deep water on an overcast day, not quite grey, not quite green, with something behind them that had always kept people at a slight, instinctive distance. He was not unkind. He was simply contained, controlled in the way that very powerful things are controlled, not because they lack force, but because they have learned the cost of letting it loose. He had married Aurelia Clark at 28, in a match that had pleased both families and, unexpectedly, had pleased Sebastian himself. She had been gentle and laughing, with copper hair and a talent for finding the absurd in formal situations that had made him, on more than one occasion, bite the inside of his cheek to keep from smiling in public. He had not been in love with her when they married. He had come to love her in the slow, dependable way that a house fills with warmth when a fire is well tended, not a blaze, but something real and lasting. Then she had carried the child, and in the carrying she had grown translucent, the way a candle burns down to nothing, still giving light, still warm, but visibly diminishing. The physicians had used words like delicate constitution and complications, and he had stood outside her door with his hands pressed flat against the plaster wall, and understood with perfect, terrible clarity that the careful, hard-built world of his life was going to change beyond recognition. He had been right. Now he stood in the cemetery on a cold October morning, and a child was telling him through iron bars that his dead son was alive. He crossed the grass in 6 long strides and crouched down so that he was at eye level with her through the bars. This close, he could see that her eyes were not merely dark. They were a very deep brown, almost black, fringed with thick lashes, and she was looking at him with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite defiance, but something poised exactly between the two. A child who had learned when to hold her ground. "Say that again," he said. His voice was very quiet. That was the register it dropped to when he was at his most dangerous, and he saw the girl read that without quite knowing she was reading it. "The baby," she said. "The one they said died. He didn't die, Your Grace. He was given away. My Aunt Nell. She's the one who knows. She was the night nurse at Ashbourne Hall in September. She told me things she shouldn't have, and she's been afraid ever since." Sebastian's jaw tightened. Behind him he heard Percival Faulkner take a sharp step forward, and he held up one hand without turning. The gesture that meant, "Stay back," which his solicitor had learned years ago to obey immediately. "What is your name?" Sebastian asked the girl. "Millie," she said. "Millie Shaw." "How old are you, Millie Shaw?" 11, Your Grace. 12 in March. "And why did you come here today? To the cemetery? How did you know to find me here?" "My aunt told me you'd come today. She still has connections among the staff at Ashbourne Hall. A kitchen maid who sends word sometimes. She heard the stone setting had been arranged for this morning, and that you always come alone, or nearly alone, to such things. She wanted to come herself, but she is frightened. Someone told her that if she spoke about what she knew, she would lose more than her position." Sebastian studied her face for a long moment. It was not a dishonest face. There was nothing in those dark eyes of the calculating quality that liars had, that slight inward focus, the tiny extra effort of maintenance. This child believed what she was saying. The question was whether what she believed was true. He stood. He reached into his coat and produced a card, plain white, his crest embossed in black in the corner, and he held it through the bars. "Tell your aunt to come to the side entrance of Ashbourne Hall tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, he said. "She will be admitted, and she will not be turned away. Tell her she has my word, that she will not lose her position, and she will not be harmed. My word, as a hawthorn. Can you remember that?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Then go home." Millie Shaw took the card with careful fingers, tucked it into her shawl, and gave him a small, solemn nod. Then she picked up her flower basket and walked away through the fog without looking back. Sebastian turned. Dorian was staring at him with a white, stricken face. Percival had gone the color of old parchment. "Sebastian," Dorian said, "surely it cannot." I don't know what it is, Sebastian said. His voice was still quiet. Tomorrow, we will know more. Tonight, say nothing to anyone. Not one word. Do you understand me? His brother nodded. Sebastian bent and picked up the miniature portrait from the wet grass. He turned it over in his gloved fingers. The painted face of an infant gazed up at him. Round cheeks, dark curling hair, eyes that the painter had captured as a deep, water-grey color. So like Sebastian's own, that every time he looked at it, something in his chest moved like a stone, being shifted from a long-settled place. He closed his hand around it. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the library of Ashbourne Hall until the fire burned to coals and then to grey ash, and he let himself think. Not in the careful, controlled way he thought about estate matters and legal affairs and the business of being a duke, but in the older, rawer way. The way he had not permitted himself to think since the physician had come out of Aurelia's room. If the child was alive, if Edward was alive somewhere, in some house, in some stranger's arms, then the month of grief he had carried like iron plates across his shoulders had been spent on the wrong thing. And whoever had taken that child from him had done it while Aurelia lay dying, while he stood in corridors unable to do anything at all, in the most helpless hours of his adult life. The rage that moved through him then was not the hot, explosive kind. It was the cold kind, the kind that lasted. Her name was Eleanor Holloway, and she arrived at the side entrance of Ashbourne Hall at 9:10 on the 5th of October, 1895, with the particular look of someone who had spent the previous night rehearsing both what they would say and all the reasons they should not say it. She was perhaps 40, with sharp features that had once been pretty and were now merely precise, and grey-streaked dark hair, pinned with more care than her plain wool coat suggested she normally took. She clutched a small cloth bag in both hands the entire time she waited in the servants' anteroom, and when the butler, a large and impeccably formal man named Hughes, showed her into Sebastian's study, she stopped in the doorway, as though considering a rapid retreat. Sebastian was standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the parkland. He did not turn immediately. He had learned over years of managing difficult conversations that the person who waited longest was rarely the more desperate one. After a moment, he turned. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat on its very edge. Sebastian remained standing. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "thank you for coming. I will not waste your time with pleasantries. My niece." "My niece," she said, correcting him, and immediately looking as though she regretted it. "Millie, she's my sister's girl. She shouldn't have gone to you. I told her not to. She went because she is a child who was given information too heavy for a child to carry alone," Sebastian said, "and she did the right thing. I need you to do the same." Eleanor Holloway's hands tightened on the bag. Her knuckles went white. "I need my position, Your Grace. I have no husband. I have Millie to look after. If I lose my—" "You will not lose your position. I told Millie that, and I am telling you directly. You are speaking to me in my private study, with no witnesses present. What you tell me will not leave this room, unless it is to find my son. Nothing you say here will be used against you. I am a man of my word, Mrs. Holloway, and I suspect you know that, or you would not have come." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she exhaled. "I was engaged as the night nurse for the Duchess," she began. "From August until it was over. I came in at 10 in the evening and left at 6 in the morning. The Duchess's labor began in the early hours of September the 3rd. I was present throughout." Sebastian said nothing. He kept his face entirely still, and his eyes on hers, the way he had learned to do in negotiations, when a single flicker of expression could cost him thousands. The baby was born just before dawn. He was small, very small, Your Grace. I won't deceive you, but he was alive. He cried. Not loudly, but he cried. I saw him breathe. I held him myself for several minutes, while the Duchess, While her Grace. Eleanor paused, pressed her lips together, while they attended to the Duchess. The Duchess had died 3 hours after delivery. Sebastian knew this. He had been told this. He had stood outside the door and been told this. "Then what?" he said. His voice was completely level. Then Dr. Pemberton came. Not the house physician. Dr. Pemberton was a man who had been brought in. I didn't know by whom. He examined the baby, and I saw him whisper something to the head nurse, Mrs. Greer. And then they asked me to step outside the room, to wait in the corridor. She stopped. "Go on," Sebastian said. I was outside for perhaps a quarter of an hour. When Mrs. Greer came out, she told me the baby had not survived, that it was common, very premature births, she said. She was very calm about it, very matter-of-fact. She told me to say nothing to the Duke, that he had enough to bear with the loss of the Duchess, and a merciful kindness was sometimes. Eleanor stopped. Her voice had dropped to nearly nothing. I knew something was wrong. I knew it. But I was afraid, Your Grace. I thought perhaps I had imagined the child's cry in all the noise and the distress of the night. I told myself I had been mistaken. But you were not mistaken, Sebastian said. No. 2 weeks later, I encountered a woman I had known some years ago. A woman who had worked as a wet nurse in several respectable households. She let slip that she had a new infant charge, a premature boy. She was very proud of it, very careful not to say too much. But she told me the name of the house where she was employed, and she said something she hadn't meant to. She said the child had been placed there by Dr. Pemberton. The cold thing inside Sebastian's chest expanded. What was the name of the house? He asked. Kensington House, Lord Ambrose Kensington's estate, 7 miles east of the village of Marlford, in Wiltshire. Sebastian was still for a long moment. Then he walked to his desk, opened the top drawer, removed a leather purse, and set it on the desk beside him, without looking at it. Your engagement as night nurse has concluded, Mrs. Holloway. But I am offering you a permanent household position at Ashbourne Hall, as assistant to the head housekeeper, if that suits you, at a wage considerably above what you have been receiving. You will want for nothing. Millie will want for nothing. I ask only 2 things in return. First, that you say nothing of what you have told me to anyone, before I have had time to investigate. Second, that you be prepared to repeat it when I need you to. Can you give me those 2 things? Eleanor Holloway looked at the purse, and then at the Duke. Her chin firmed. Yes, Your Grace, I can. The moment she was gone, Sebastian sat down at his desk and wrote 3 letters in rapid succession. 1 to his solicitor, Percival Faulkner. 1 to a private inquiry agent in London named Callum Roberts, whose discretion and effectiveness Sebastian had had occasion to rely upon twice before. And 1 to Lord Ambrose Kensington himself. A brief, perfectly courteous note, requesting the pleasure of a visit at Sebastian's earliest convenience, on a matter of mutual interest. He did not say what the matter was. He sealed all 3 letters, rang for Hughes, and instructed him to have them dispatched by hand within the hour. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the miniature portrait he had set on the desk before him. The painted infant, the grey eyes, the dark hair, alive, he thought, somewhere in Wiltshire, in a house that did not belong to him, in arms that were not his, growing older every day in a life that had been arranged without his knowledge or consent, by people who had looked at his grief and decided they knew better than to let him feel it for the right reasons. The rage was still cold, but it had found its shape now. It had a direction. He went to Wiltshire on the 7th of October with Percival Faulkner and 2 of his most reliable footmen. He sent no advance notice of the exact date or time. A man who announced himself too precisely gave the other party too much opportunity to arrange things. Kensington House was a handsome Georgian property, set well back from the road behind a long gravel drive and a stand of chestnuts that had begun to turn gold at their tips. It was smaller than Ashbourne Hall, but well maintained, and confident in the way that old money was always confident. Not showy, simply permanent. Lord Ambrose Kensington was at home. He received Sebastian in a drawing room, decorated in shades of cream and sage, furnished with the heavy, comfortable solidity of a man who expected to live well for a very long time. He was perhaps 55, with white hair and the florid complexion of someone who ate generously and exercised moderately, and he had the particular manner of a man accustomed to being the most powerful person in any given room, a manner which, in Sebastian's presence, had begun to recalibrate itself almost immediately. They had met twice before, at London functions. They were not friends. They were not enemies. They were merely two men whose rank and geography placed them occasionally in each other's orbit. Sebastian accepted a chair. He accepted tea, which he did not drink. He engaged in 3 minutes and 40 seconds of social preamble. He counted, and then he set down his untouched cup and looked at Ambrose Kensington with the full weight of his attention. "Lord Kensington," he said, "I will dispense with indirection. I have information suggesting that an infant, a male child, born at Ashbourne Hall on the 3rd of September of this year, was placed in your household through the agency of a Dr. Pemberton of London. I am here to see the child." Kensington's face did several things in rapid succession. It went blank. Then it went careful. Then it settled into something like resignation, which told Sebastian more than a denial would have. "Hawthorne," he said quietly, "there are things you do not know." "I am here to know them," Sebastian said. Kensington stood. He walked to the door, opened it, and spoke in a low voice to the footman outside. Then he came back and sat down and looked at his hands. "The child was brought to me by Pemberton," he said. "I was told the Duke of Ashbourne, that you had given instructions for the child to be quietly placed in a good household, privately, without the entailments of legitimacy that would cause—" He stopped. Something moved in his face. "I was told the child's legitimacy was disputed, that there were questions about the Duchess's conduct during her confinement. Questions raised by the Duke himself. The silence that followed was of the kind that precedes violence. Sebastian was aware of it, and controlled it completely. "Who told you that?" he said. Each word was separate and distinct. "Pemberton. And I received a letter, unsigned but clearly from a man of rank, indicating that the child was to be kept healthy and well provided for, but kept away from Ashbourne and out of any public record. Someone forged my instructions," Sebastian said, "or invented them entirely. I gave no such instructions. I knew nothing of my son's survival. I was told the child died at birth." Kensington went very still. Then, slowly, the color drained from his face as he understood the full weight of what he was hearing. "Good God," he said, barely above a whisper. "The child. Now, if you please." Kensington rose and led him from the room, without another word. The nursery was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a bright corridor, with yellow-papered walls. A woman Sebastian did not know, the wet nurse, presumably, sat in a chair near the window, and in a small white crib, placed in a band of autumn sunlight, lay the most remarkable thing Sebastian had seen in a month of terrible days. A child. Small. Undeniably. Small for 5 weeks. Though he had some color now. Some roundness, where there had presumably been only angles. Dark hair. Fine as silk thread, curling softly at his temples. Eyes closed in sleep. Thick dark lashes against pink cheeks. Sebastian stood in the doorway for so long that Percival, behind him, cleared his throat softly. He went to the crib. He stood over it. He reached in, slowly, carefully, and placed 2 fingers against the child's cheek, which was warm. The child stirred. A small fist uncurled. The eyes opened. Grey. Not pale grey. Deep grey. Dark as seawater at depth. Sebastian's own eyes looked back at him from a face the size of his hand, and the thing that had gone very quiet inside him a month ago made a sound like a lock opening. "His name is Edward," Sebastian said, to no one in particular. His voice was not quite steady. "He is coming home." There were legal matters. There were always legal matters. But Kensington, who was by all evidence a man who had been deceived as thoroughly as Sebastian himself, cooperated with the speed and thoroughness of someone who wanted the whole business resolved before it could touch him any further. Dr. Pemberton, when Callum Roberts located him 2 days later, proved to be the kind of man who, when presented with the full consequence of what he had done, collapsed into confession with barely any resistance at all. He had been paid. The sum was substantial. He had been approached by an intermediary whose name he gave to Roberts immediately, without needing to be asked twice. The intermediary worked for a man Sebastian knew. His name was Gideon Ashbourne, the late Duke's younger brother, Sebastian's uncle, who stood next in line for the title after Edward, and who had, it turned out, spent the better part of the previous year quietly and methodically arranging things so that he might continue to stand there indefinitely. The rage was no longer cold. For approximately 4 minutes after receiving Roberts's report, it was not cold at all. Then it went cold again, and Sebastian wrote a letter to his solicitor and another to his barrister, and he began the business of dismantling his uncle's life with the same careful, patient precision with which his uncle had attempted to dismantle his. Gideon Ashbourne came to Ashbourne Hall on the 14th of October. He had not been invited. He arrived in the mid-morning in a well-appointed carriage, dressed in black, as though he were the one in mourning, and he had the audacity to present himself at the front entrance and request an audience with his nephew on a matter of family business. Sebastian received him in the entrance hall, not in the drawing room, not in the library, in the entrance hall, standing, with Hughes behind him, and the door not yet fully closed against the October cold. The message of this arrangement was not subtle, and was not intended to be. Gideon was 61 years old, lean and grey-haired, and precise in the manner of men who had spent their lives in the careful management of appearances. He had been, for the 31 years of Sebastian's life, simply an uncle, present at the appropriate occasions, civil at dinners, sending letters at Christmas with the reliable punctuality of someone who understood that family connections were a form of investment. Sebastian had never liked him. He had never had sufficient cause to do more than not like him. He had sufficient cause now. "Sebastian," Gideon said, as though it were a normal morning visit. "I came, as soon as I heard about the child. Remarkable news. I understand congratulations are in order." Sebastian looked at him for a long moment without speaking. He looked at him the way he looked at things he intended to take apart, with the careful, comprehensive attention of someone cataloguing every component. "You came," Sebastian said, "to understand how much I know." Something moved in Gideon's face, very quickly, very briefly. The expression of a man who had prepared for several versions of this conversation, and had hoped, without conviction, for a different one. "I don't know what you will want to hear this clearly," Sebastian said. "So I will say at once. I know everything. The physician, the nurse, the intermediary, the letter to Kensington, the sum paid. I know it all, and it is all in writing, in the hands of my barrister and my solicitor, and it has been there since the 9th of October. You came here to discover whether you had time to manage this. You do not. You have already run out of time." He paused. "That is what I wanted you to know. You may leave now." Gideon stood in the entrance hall of a house that had never been his, and looked at the nephew who had always been between him and everything he wanted and understood, finally, what it felt like when something went irrevocably wrong. He left without another word. Sebastian watched the carriage disappear down the drive, and then turned and walked back into the house, and did not think about it again until the arrest came, which was exactly as he had intended. Edward Hawthorne, future 9th Duke of Ashbourne, came home to Ashbourne Hall on the 10th of October, 1895. He weighed 7 pounds 3 ounces, and had an opinion about being placed in an unfamiliar crib that he expressed loudly and at length for most of his first night back. Sebastian sat beside the crib until the boy slept. The matter of appropriate care occupied the next several days. A reputable monthly nurse was engaged immediately, but Edward was small and had been given an uncertain beginning, and the physicians were clear that he needed consistent, expert care and significant attention for his first months. Sebastian interviewed 4 candidates for the position of infant governess, a somewhat informal designation that covered the period before a proper nursery governess would be appropriate, and found 3 of them either inadequate or unsettling in ways he could not fully articulate to himself. The 4th arrived on the 17th of October, and her name was Elise Faulkner. She was the younger sister of Percival Faulkner, something Sebastian had not known until the moment she was shown into his study and introduced herself, which had caused him a brief, complicated moment. He was constitutionally inclined to trust people his solicitor recommended, and simultaneously cautious about the opacity of family arrangements. The coincidence of names resolved itself quickly. She was a Faulkner by birth, but had been working independently for several years in the households of 3 separate families, all of whom Percival had quietly approached on Sebastian's behalf, and all of whom had provided the same report. Exceptional, gentle but firm, remarkable instinct with children, particularly infants. And this had been noted by each household with a slight air of reluctant admiration, entirely impossible to intimidate. That last quality had appeared in 2 of the 3 reports. Sebastian found it interesting. She was 24. That was the first thing he noticed, because it surprised him. He had expected someone older. She was of medium height, with the kind of stillness about her that was not timidity but restraint. The way still water was not motionless, but simply collecting itself. Her hair was a warm, deep brown, dressed simply at the back of her neck. Her face was not a face that announced itself. It was the kind of face that a man might pass in a hallway and think ordinary, and then think about unexpectedly when lying awake at 3 in the morning, and be puzzled why. Her eyes were a very clear, very direct brown amber, the color of tea held up to light. When they met his, they did not waver or drop as most people's did in his presence. They simply met him, even and steady, as though he was a person rather than a title, which was either impertinence or character, and he was not yet sure which. She sat across from him in the straight-backed interview chair, with her hands folded in her lap, and answered his questions with the careful, precise completeness of someone who had prepared, without over-rehearsing. "I understand the situation with Lord Edward is unusual," she said, when he had asked whether she was comfortable with the particular circumstances of the child's history. A difficult beginning, a disruption of care in his earliest weeks. But infants are more resilient than is commonly assumed, Your Grace, and consistent, warm attention in the early months does a great deal to repair what inconsistency has damaged. I have seen it more than once. You seem very certain of that, Sebastian said. I am certain of it, she said, without apology. It is what the evidence of my experience tells me. I would rather be honest than reassuring. He looked at her for a long moment. When can you begin? He asked. Tomorrow morning, if you wish. I wish, he said, and almost, very nearly, smiled. She was, as it turned out, everything the 3 households had reported, and several things they had not mentioned. She was patient in a way that had not been manufactured by effort, but was simply native to her, like the color of her hair. She had a voice, low and unhurried, with a warm, steady quality like the sound a fire made when it had settled into itself properly, and Edward responded to it the way all living things responded to warmth. It was not a remarkable voice in any obvious sense. Sebastian would have been hard-pressed to explain what made it so. He simply found, on more than one occasion, that he had stopped outside the nursery door to hear it finish a sentence before he knocked. Within 3 days of Elise's arrival, Edward slept through longer stretches of the night, took his feeding with less distress, and spent his waking hours with a settled contentment that the monthly nurse described, with professional restraint, as a marked improvement. Within a week, Sebastian found himself unable to attribute this entirely to professional competence. Sebastian noticed. He also noticed other things, with a precision he found slightly inconvenient. He noticed the way she moved through the nursery, economical and quiet, never a wasted gesture. He noticed the way she spoke to Edward, not in the exaggerated, simplified tones some nurses used, but in full, considered sentences, as though the child's intelligence deserved the same respect regardless of his current capacity to reply. He noticed, particularly, the way she held the boy, with a kind of settled, complete ease that made it apparent the child was neither burdensome nor precious, but simply hers, for the time being, in the way that things entrusted to careful people became temporarily theirs. He visited the nursery each morning and each evening. He told himself this was his duty as a father, recovering his son after a month of loss. This was true. It was not the complete truth. The complete truth was that the nursery had become, in a matter of days, the room in Ashbourne Hall where he most wanted to be. There was an evening in the 3rd week of October when he understood, with the precise and inconvenient clarity he brought to most things, that something had shifted. She had been in the garden that afternoon. It was one of those days when October produced unexpected warmth, a last chance brightness before the cold settled in for good, and she had brought Edward out in his pram to take the air as the physicians had recommended. Sebastian had seen them from the library window without meaning to. She was standing with her back to the house in the long light, her head tilted back, face turned up toward the sun with her eyes closed. Her hair had loosened slightly at the back of her neck, a single dark strand moving in the faint breeze. She was quite still. In the particular way she was still, not absent, but collected, as though she was gathering something she needed from the light and the quiet. He had stood at the library window and watched her for considerably longer than he should have. He had not watched a woman like that, with that specific quality of hunger, barely acknowledged, that particular awareness of another person as entirely, distractingly present, since the early months of his acquaintance with Aurelia. And even then, he thought, with the honesty that the moment forced on him, it had not felt quite like this, not quite so sharp, not quite so immediate, not quite so much like something that had been there from the first day and had only been waiting for him to stop pretending otherwise. He turned away from the window. He sat down at his desk and picked up his pen and looked at the letter he had been writing and realized he had absolutely no recollection of what it was about. On the 23rd of October, he came to the nursery at 8:15 in the evening to find Elise sitting in the low chair beside the fire, with Edward against her shoulder and a book open on her knee. She was reading aloud from it, something that appeared to be natural history, based on the words he caught in the doorway, and the combination of the fire's light and the low sound of her voice and the child's settled weight against her shoulder formed a picture so quietly domestic that Sebastian stood in the doorway for considerably longer than was strictly necessary before announcing his presence. She looked up. The amber eyes met his. Something passed through them, a brief, fine-edged awareness, before they settled back to their customary steadiness.
"He has been awake since 7,
she said, as though they were in the middle of a conversation.
"I thought reading aloud might be soothing. He seems to prefer natural history to poetry, which your solicitor's brother will simply have to accept."
It took Sebastian a moment to understand this. Then he realized she was joking about Percival, who was famously devoted to Tennyson. The unexpectedness of it, delivered in the same even tone as everything else she said, produced a short, surprised sound from him that was not quite a laugh, but was the closest thing to one he had made in 6 weeks. Elise looked briefly, distinctly satisfied by this, in a way she did not quite conceal quickly enough. He came further into the room and sat down in the other chair, the one across the fire. He reached out and took Edward's small fist, which uncurled around his finger with that automatic trust that infants had, and that still, each time it happened, did something to the inside of his chest. They sat in the firelit room for a while without speaking, and the silence was not the kind that required filling. November arrived, and brought with it the particular cold that settled into large country houses, like a guest who had not been invited and did not intend to leave. The trees in the parkland went bare. The fog that had haunted the cemetery on the morning of October the 4th returned to haunt the lawns of Ashbourne Hall with a damp, grey insistence. Inside, the house was warm in the rooms where fires were kept, and the nursery was always one of those rooms. Sebastian had begun to arrange his day around the nursery visits in ways he was not fully conscious of. His morning was the estate, correspondence, tenant matters, legal proceedings against his uncle Gideon, which were grinding forward with the slow, satisfying inevitability of a millstone. His afternoon was the house, library, study, the management of the 100 small mechanisms that kept a ducal estate operating. His evenings had become the nursery, and he did not examine this too closely. He and Elise had developed, by the beginning of November, the kind of ease that grew between people who occupied the same small space with goodwill, and found that the goodwill was returned. They talked, easily, much more easily than Sebastian talked to most people, about Edward's progress, about the house, about books. He had discovered that she read extensively, and without the feminine self-censorship that women in society applied to their own opinions. She would say precisely what she thought about a book, and if the thought was unflattering, she said it in the same level tone as everything else, and he had found himself constructing arguments against her positions, not because he disagreed, but because he wanted to hear what she would say next. She had read more widely than he expected, more widely in some areas than he himself had. This should not have surprised him as much as it did. He found it disproportionately interesting. He was aware, with the self-knowledge that made him cautious, of the particular quality of this interest. It was not the interest he had felt during the early days of his acquaintance with Aurelia, that had been warm and appreciative, and accompanied by the pleasant social certainty that both families approved. What he felt when he was with Elise Faulkner was sharper and less comfortable and harder to categorize. There was a pull to it that he noticed more clearly when she was not in the room than when she was. The way one noticed the absence of heat rather than its presence. He was a man who had been married. He was a man who knew the difference between appreciation and desire, between intellectual companionship and the thing that lived beneath it when the person in question was, when they were. He did not complete this particular line of thinking. He was very careful about that. On the 4th of November there was a storm. Not a dramatic storm, no lightning, no theatrical crescendo, merely a prolonged, heavy rain that swept in from the west in the early afternoon and settled in with the determination of something that would not be hurried. The windows streaked. The drives turned to rivers. The lights were lit early, throughout the house. Sebastian came to the nursery at his usual evening hour and found it empty. Not of the child, who was asleep in his crib, but of Elise. He stood for a moment, feeling the absence with a clarity that was instructive, and then heard a sound from the small adjoining room that served as a sitting room for the nursery staff. He pushed the door open. She was sitting on the window seat with her knees drawn up and a shawl around her shoulders, watching the rain. She had not heard him over the sound of the weather. The fire in the small grate behind her lit her in profile, the clean line of her jaw, the weight of her hair against her neck, the curve of her shoulder beneath the shawl. She was holding a cup of tea in both hands, and she was completely, entirely unguarded in a way that he had not seen before, and it stopped him as completely as a physical barrier. She was not performing anything. She was not being a governess or an employee or a woman conscious of her position in relation to his. She was simply a person, resting, watching rain. And the person who was resting was, Sebastian recognized this, with a distinct lack of comfort. quite extraordinarily lovely in the firelight, in the undefended way that people were lovely when they did not know they were being seen. He should have retreated. He knew this. He did not retreat. He cleared his throat. She turned, and for one fraction of a moment, barely perceptible, but perceptible to him, something moved across her face before the composure settled back into place. Something that was not alarm, but was the aftermath of alarm. The expression of a person who has been caught thinking something they had not intended to think, in the presence of someone who could notice. "Your Grace," she said, "I am sorry. I didn't hear you." "The door was open," he said, which was not quite true. He moved into the room. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," she said. "It's your house." "That doesn't preclude intrusion," he said. She looked at him. The amber tea eyes were warmer in the firelight, something in them that was not quite what it usually was. The storm behind the window pressed the world smaller. "Sit down if you like," she said. "The rain is worth watching." He sat down across from her, on the other end of the window seat. The window was wide and the seat was not. Not so narrow that it was inappropriate, but narrow enough that he was aware of the distance between them as a definite, measured thing, rather than the easy social distance of a library or a nursery. Aware of it in the way one was aware of the approach of weather, a shift in pressure, a change in the quality of the air. They watched the rain. After a while she said, without preamble, that she was sorry about his wife. She said it simply, and without the elaborate delicacy with which everyone else in his life said it, as though it were a thing that could just be said, between people. He was quiet for a moment. "She was a good woman," he said. "She deserved more years than she had." "Was she afraid?" Elise asked. And then, quickly, "I'm sorry. That is—" "No," he said. She was not afraid. She was very calm at the end. She worried about Edward. That was the thing she kept saying, that someone would look after him. He had not said this aloud to anyone. It had lived in him for 7 weeks, like a coal, warm and painful, and saying it now, in the rain-pressed quiet of this small room, to this woman who was watching him, with those clear, steady eyes, was like opening a window to cool air. "Someone is looking after him," Elise said, gently. 2 people, in fact. He looked at her. She looked back. The firelight moved between them. What happened next was not a kiss. It was not an action at all. It was a decision, the kind that is made not by intention, but by the simultaneous recognition, in 2 people, that something has already been decided by forces neither of them controlled. He became aware of the space between them, its precise measurement, its particular quality of imminence, and of the fact that she was aware of it too. The way her breath had changed, almost imperceptibly. The way her fingers had tightened around the cup. He looked away first, at the rain. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The fire behind them settled with a soft sound. The rain continued its patient assault on the glass. He was acutely, exhaustingly aware of the distance between them. 6 inches, perhaps 8, as though it had weight and temperature. He was aware of the curve of her shoulder, where the shawl had slipped slightly, of the way she was holding herself very still, which was different from her usual stillness, more deliberate, more maintained, of the fact that her breathing had not returned to its ordinary rhythm. He was a man of considerable self-possession. He had negotiated with men who wanted to take things from him. He had stood in the corridor outside his wife's room and heard the words no man wanted to hear, and had not broken in front of another living person. He had, in the past month, recovered his stolen son, and begun the systematic destruction of his uncle's life, with his hands entirely steady throughout. He was finding, in this small room, with this woman 6 inches away, and the rain pressing the world down to the size of a window, that self-possession was a considerably more effortful business than he had ever previously found it. He did not touch her. He did not move closer. He sat with the restraint of it, like a stone held against the chest, and eventually she exhaled, a very small sound, barely audible beneath the rain, and he understood that she was doing the same thing he was doing, and the knowledge of that was simultaneously the most comforting and the most tormenting thing he had felt in a very long time. The solicitor Percival Faulkner arrived at Ashbourne Hall on the 9th of November with a leather satchel of papers pertaining to the case against Gideon Ashbourne, and also, Sebastian suspected from the slightly particular way he set the satchel down, certain information he had not committed to the post. They were deep into the legal matters. Gideon had hired a barrister of considerable reputation, which was entirely expected, when Percival set his pen down and engaged in the brief, preparatory clearing of the throat that meant he had something non-legal to say. "Elise seems to be doing very well," he said. "She is exceptional," Sebastian said. "Edward is thriving." "Yes, good. I'm glad to hear it." A pause. "She admires you, you know." Sebastian looked at him. "She has not said so to me," Percival said carefully. "She would not. But I know my sister, and I have noticed things, over the years, about the people she admires. There is a quality to her attention." The room was quiet for a moment. "You are telling me this in the capacity of her brother," Sebastian said. "Not a question. I am telling you this in the capacity of your solicitor and your friend," Percival said, "which are two positions that occasionally require me to say things that are not strictly legal matters. Sebastian, she is in your employ. She is in your house. Whatever either of you may feel, the circumstances require more care than ordinary." Sebastian had known this. He had known it in the way one knows an unpleasant fact that one has been declining to look at directly, with peripheral, uncomfortable awareness. Hearing it said aloud by the person whose sister was the subject did not make it more comfortable. "I am aware of the circumstances," he said. "I know you are. I also know you are 6 weeks out of mourning for Aurelia, and 7 weeks out of the worst shock of your adult life. I am saying, slowly. That's all I am saying. Whatever it is, slowly." Sebastian looked at the fire for a moment. "She is remarkable," he said. The word was inadequate, and he knew it as soon as he said it, but the real vocabulary for what he meant was not vocabulary he was prepared to use with her brother. "Yes," said Percival, very quietly. "She is." He was careful after that. More careful than he had been in the first 3 weeks of November, when he had been less careful than he should have been, and he knew it. He still came to the nursery each morning and evening. He would not pretend he did not, and besides, Edward had begun to watch for him, which was a development that made everything else feel simultaneously simpler and more complicated. But he was deliberately, consciously correct in the drawing of distances. Professional, appropriate. He was not entirely sure whether Elise noticed the shift or not. He suspected she did. She was not a person who failed to notice things. If she did notice, she gave no sign of it in any way that he could interpret with certainty. She was the same steady, warm, quietly formidable presence she had been from the first day. She continued to say exactly what she thought. She continued to meet his eyes with that even, uncalibrated directness. If anything, the directness had become slightly more careful, slightly more deliberate, which told him something but not enough. There was a particular evening in the middle of November, the 15th, he remembered it afterward, because the estate accounts had been peculiarly trying, and he had come to the nursery with the relief of a man heading for the one room in the house where the air was different, when he found Elise in the process of settling Edward after a bath, and the boy was in a state of extreme indignation about something only he fully understood. And Elise had him against her shoulder and was talking to him in that low, steady voice. And she looked up when Sebastian entered, and something passed between them that was entirely invisible and entirely legible. A recognition. The kind shared between people who have moved through parallel weeks of restrained awareness and arrived simultaneously at the same quietly desperate knowledge. She looked away first. She turned her attention back to Edward and said something about the bath and whether the water temperature had been right. Sebastian agreed that it had probably been right. He took his usual chair and held out his finger, and Edward grasped it in the automatic, complete trust of the very young. The evening proceeded correctly, properly, decorously. He left the nursery at the usual hour and walked down the corridor, with his hands clasped behind his back, and the particular tension of a man who has said precisely the right things and is acutely aware of everything he has not said. He had walked this corridor 100 times. It was 62 feet from the nursery door to the turn that led to the east wing, and he knew every floorboard that softened underfoot, every place where the lamplight fell long or short. Tonight, the 62 feet felt like an act of discipline. Every step away from that room, from the warmth of it and the soft sound of her voice, and the particular quality of her attention when she looked at him, was a choice he was making with the full weight of his will. He was a man of 31, who had lived most of his adult life at a careful remove from his own wants. He had thought, until recently, that this was simply his character. He was beginning to understand that it was armor, and that armor, however well made, was not the same thing as not feeling. It was only the same thing as not showing. He wanted her. It was simple, and it was not simple at all. He wanted the conversation, and the silence, and the way she looked at Edward, and the way she occasionally looked at him, as though he were a person she had decided to know, rather than a title she was required to manage. He wanted the particular quality of being in a room where she also was. He wanted her close. He wanted her warmth. He wanted the precise span of the distance between them on that window seat to be closed rather than maintained, and the directness of this knowledge, standing in a corridor at 9:30 at night, was both clarifying and deeply inconvenient. He went to bed. He did not sleep for some time. His uncle Gideon was arrested on the 22nd of November on charges that Percival described to Sebastian, with the controlled satisfaction of a man who had spent weeks constructing a case, and was now watching it perform exactly as designed. The charge was conspiracy to defraud, the fraud being the systematic removal of a legitimate heir from his birthright through falsified medical testimony and the suborning of household staff. Dr. Pemberton had turned witness. Mrs. Greer, the head nurse, had broken entirely upon being questioned, and had added testimony Sebastian had not expected about a second payment and a meeting at a London hotel. The barrister Gideon had hired had begun to look at his own brief with the expression of a man who had accepted a commission he was beginning to regret. Sebastian received the news with composure. He thanked Percival. He returned to his desk and completed the morning's correspondence. He did not feel triumph. He felt relief in a cold form. The mechanism that had been working against his son had been stopped. Edward was safe. That was the important thing. Everything else was noise. But in the quiet of the library that evening, with the fire burning low and a glass of brandy he was not drinking at his elbow, Sebastian sat and looked at nothing in particular and thought with unusual clarity about what he wanted. He had spent his adult life managing want with the same discipline he applied to everything else, acknowledging it where it was useful, containing it where it was not, directing it toward the productive rather than the dangerous. He had wanted Aurelia in the quiet, steady way he had come to love her. He had wanted his son in the raw, immediate way that had surprised him when he had looked into the crib at Kensington House. What he felt when he thought about Elise Faulkner was different from both of these, and he had been not examining it for 3 weeks now, which meant it had gotten very large in the space where he wasn't examining it. It was not just the fire in her presence, though that was real, was a warmth and a pull that he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge. It was not just the conversation, or the steady directness of her eyes, or the low, clear sound of her voice. It was something that included all of these things, and exceeded them, a sense of recognition, of something answering something in him that had not known it was asking a question. The feeling of a house that had been empty for a long time, beginning to be warm again. He understood, falling in love with her, He sat with that for a while. Then he picked up the brandy, which he had not drunk, and set it back down, and went to bed. December came in cold and bright. The grounds of Ashbourne Hall were heavy with frost each morning, the lawns silver-white at sunrise, the bare trees black against the pale sky. Inside, fires burned in every inhabited room from early morning, and the house acquired the particular close warmth of a stone building in winter, all heavy curtains and the smell of wood smoke and beeswax. Edward was 3 months old. He had grown, not dramatically but steadily, with the determined, incremental quality of a thing that intended to continue. He was awake more each day, demanding more, giving back more. He had begun to fix his eyes on faces with a focus that was unmistakably deliberate. He knew Sebastian's face. He knew Elise's. He knew them differently, which Sebastian found he could not look at directly without a complicated sensation that had no clean name. On the 3rd of December, Sebastian made a decision, not an impulsive one. He had not made impulsive decisions since he was 20, and the consequences of that particular decision had taught him more than any deliberate lesson could have. He thought about it for 3 days, from the 30th of November through the 2nd of December, turning it from every angle with the same systematic patience he brought to anything important. He considered the objections. He considered the timing. He considered what Percival had said about slowly, and whether slowly had been sufficiently honored. Then on the morning of December the 3rd, he sent a note to the nursery. Just a note, a simple one, asking whether Miss Faulkner would be free to speak with him privately at 4 o'clock in the library. He had not called her Miss Faulkner in 2 months. The note, in consequence, read with a formality that was its own kind of communication. She came at 4 o'clock exactly. She was wearing the dark blue dress she sometimes wore on Sunday afternoons, the one that was more careful than her working clothes, as though she had known from the word Miss Faulkner in the note that this was that kind of conversation, and had dressed accordingly. Her hair was the same, simply dressed, the same dark warmth at the back of her neck, but she had put a small pearl at each ear, which Sebastian had not seen before, and the slight extra care of it told him things. He was standing by the fire. He waited until she had come fully into the room, and the door was closed before he spoke. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Please sit down." "I prefer to stand," she said. "If it's all the same." He looked at her. She was braced, not rigidly, but with the internal steadiness of someone who had prepared for a conversation they were not certain would go the way they hoped, and had decided to meet it standing regardless. Something in him eased at the sight of her like that. He had been more nervous about this particular conversation than he had been about the meeting with Kensington, which had involved the recovery of his stolen child, and that told him something extremely clear about the current priorities of his inner life. "I have a number of things to say to you," he said, "and I want to say them in the right order, so if you will bear with me." She inclined her head slightly, waiting. "First," he said, "I want to say that I know the position you are in is not a simple one. You are employed in my house. You care for my son. The power I have over the material circumstances of your life is considerable, and I am aware of it, and I want you to know that what I am about to say to you has no bearing on any of that. Whatever your response is, your position is your position, your wage is your wage, and your place in this house is not contingent on anything except your own wish to stay in it." Something shifted in her face. She was listening very carefully. "Second," he said, "Edward loves you. Not in the way he loves me. Differently, with a different quality. The way a plant loves water, differently than it loves sunlight. Both are necessary. I have watched this happen over 2 months, and I want you to know that I see it, and I am grateful for it, with a depth I am not sure I can express adequately. You gave him something in the first weeks of his life that I could not have given him alone. Whatever else happens, that is true." Her chin had lifted slightly. The amber eyes were very bright. She was holding herself very still. "Third," he said, and his voice dropped a fraction, losing the careful register of the first 2 points. I did not intend to come here. To this. To whatever this is. You arrived 6 weeks after Aurelia died, and I told myself that what I felt was admiration for a remarkable woman, which was true, and that it was nothing more than that, which was not. I have spent the 3 months since, all of October and November, and now into December, being consciously correct in all the ways that are required of me, and I find that I am tired of it. He stopped. He was a man who had given hundreds of speeches, managed hundreds of negotiations, maintained composure in situations that would have broken a less disciplined person. He was acutely, absurdly aware that he was less sure of himself in this moment than in any of those. "I am in love with you," he said. "I am not asking anything of you on the strength of that statement. I am telling you because it is true, and because I find I cannot continue to occupy the same house as you, and attend to the same fireplace, and the same child, and pretend with any further conviction that it is not." Silence, long enough that he felt it in every nerve. Then Elise moved. Not toward him, just slightly, the smallest shift in weight, as though something she had been holding back from had been given permission to stop being held back. The careful posture changed by almost nothing, and by everything. "I have been telling myself the same kinds of things," she said. Her voice was lower than usual, and the control in it was considerable, and beneath it something warm and raw. "The appropriate ones. The sensible ones. You are grieving. You are my employer. The household. What the household would say. What my brother would say." "Percival," Sebastian said, and something that was almost humor moved through his voice. "Percival told me to go slowly. He said this 6 weeks ago. I have been going very slowly." Something happened to her face. The careful composure cracked, not broke, cracked, like light coming through, and she looked at him with an expression that was at once entirely unguarded and entirely specific. The expression of a person who has been hoping something without admitting it, and has now had it confirmed, and the relief of confirmation was its own kind of undoing. "Has it been slow?" she said, and there was something in her voice that was almost laughter, almost something else. "It has been the longest 2 months of my life." He was across the room before he was aware of deciding to be. Not quickly. Nothing so uncontrolled. Deliberately, the way he did everything, but with a directness that left no ambiguity about his intention. He stopped an arm's length from her. This close, in the firelight, he could see the flush that had moved up her cheekbones, could see the way her breathing had changed, not dramatically, but changed, the slight quickening that she was not quite managing to conceal. Her eyes on his were wide and steady, and entirely, nakedly honest, which was, he was realizing, the quality in her that affected him most severely. She never pretended. Not even now. "Miss Faulkner," he said, very quietly. Elise, the first syllable of her name in his voice, seemed to do something to the air between them. She felt it. He saw her feel it. "Your Grace," she said, and then, barely above a whisper, "Sebastian." He reached up and touched her face, just her cheek, one gloved hand, the back of his fingers against the warmth of her skin, and she closed her eyes for a single, brief moment, with the particular expression of someone receiving something they have wanted without allowing themselves to know how much they have wanted it. When she opened them again, he was very close. The kiss was not hurried. He had waited long enough for hurrying to seem absurd. It was deliberate and careful and warm, and she responded to it with the same quality she brought to everything. Complete, honest, nothing held back, and his hand had moved from her cheek to the line of her jaw, and the 2 months of careful, correct, necessary distance collapsed into something that was so thoroughly its opposite that it seemed impossible it had ever existed. When they separated, neither of them moved away. They stood close in the firelit library, with the winter pressing against the windows outside, and he was still holding her face, and she had both hands flat against his chest, not pushing, the opposite of pushing, and they looked at each other, with the eyes of people who have just discovered the precise dimensions of something they were hoping for, and found them larger than they dared suppose. "Edward is going to need a great deal of looking after," Sebastian said, after a moment. His voice was not entirely steady. "For a very long time." "He is," Elise agreed. Her voice was no steadier. "A very long time indeed." He looked at her with everything he had been careful not to look at her with for 2 months, and she looked back with the same currency, and neither of them pretended that they were talking about the child. There was no society wedding. Sebastian had given the matter considerable thought, and had concluded that the spectacle of a society wedding, with its attendant scrutiny and its 100 small performances, was not what either of them wanted, or needed, at this particular point in the particular story they were living. What they had, instead, was a quiet ceremony at the village church near Ashbourne Hall on the 14th of March, 1896, with 6 months between the death of Aurelia and the renewal of Sebastian's life, being exactly the right length of time for anyone who wished to form an opinion about the timing to keep that opinion to themselves. The ceremony was attended by Percival Faulkner, who managed the considerable feat of looking simultaneously vindicating, emotional, and legally thorough, and by Dorian Hawthorne, who had spent the intervening months between October and March performing an admirable series of personality adjustments, and had arrived at a genuine affection for his new sister-in-law that surprised everyone, including himself. And by Millie Shaw, who stood in the third pew in a new dress, the color of bluebells that had been provided without ceremony by Sebastian's housekeeper, and who watched the proceedings with the same large, steady, dark eyes with which she had watched Sebastian across the cemetery bars 5 months earlier, and who afterward accepted a piece of wedding cake, with the composure of someone who felt they had been in some small way responsible for the whole business. She was not wrong about this. Edward was 6 months old, and was in the arms of Lady Vivian Hawthorne, Dorian's new wife of 3 weeks, the former Miss Vivian Roberts of Bath, who had been quietly in love with the younger Hawthorne brother since the previous autumn, and who had accepted him in February, with a promptness that made Dorian insufferably cheerful about the entire affair. She had taken to Edward with a fierceness that astonished her husband, and he slept through the ceremony entirely, which everyone took as a sign of either approval or contentment, or both. Afterward, in the carriage on the way back to Ashbourne Hall, Elise sat beside Sebastian with her hand in his, and her head against his shoulder, and the March light came through the carriage window in a long, pale bar that moved across the floor with the motion of the wheels. She said, after a while, that she had been thinking about Millie. "She should come to us," Sebastian said, which was exactly what she had been going to say. "She and her aunt. There is room enough, God knows, and Eleanor Holloway has more than earned a permanent position. Millie can have proper schooling, a proper childhood." "Yes," Elise said. "That is exactly what I was thinking." He looked down at her. The amber eyes were warm in the morning light, completely uncalibrated, giving him everything. "You were going to propose it whether I agreed or not," he said. "Yes," she said again, without apology. "I was." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "Good," he said. Gideon Ashbourne's trial concluded in April of 1896. He was convicted on 3 counts and sentenced to a period of imprisonment that was, by the standard of what he had done, perhaps insufficient, and by the standard of what the family name could withstand, perhaps more than sufficient. Sebastian attended the verdict and left immediately after, without speaking to his uncle, without looking at him. Some things did not require the dignity of engagement. Dr. Pemberton was stripped of his medical license, and his name removed from the register. Mrs. Greer, the head nurse, had already fled to the country and was not heard of again. These facts were recorded. The world moved on from them. In the summer of 1896, Edward Hawthorne, legitimate heir to the Dukedom of Ashbourne, took his first unaided steps across the nursery floor. He was 10 months old, which the monthly nurse declared precocious, with a pride that suggested she felt personally responsible, and he was extremely pleased with himself about it. He went 4 steps and then sat down with a decisive thump and looked up at the 2 people watching him with the expression of someone who felt he had made his point. Sebastian had been in the doorway. He crossed to the center of the room and crouched down to the child's level, and the child reached both arms up, with the absolute confidence of someone who has never once doubted the response. He picked his son up and felt the small body settle against his chest, with the same automatic, complete trust as that first unfurling fist in the crib at Kensington House, and something in him that had been very quietly reassembling itself since October the 4th, looked around at the warm, sunlit nursery and the woman standing in the window, his wife, in the first month of their first child together, her hand resting just perceptibly at her side, and recognized, simply and without ceremony, that this was what the world had been working toward. Not the title, not the estate, not the 300-year-old stone walls. This room, these people, this